This is one of those panels in the time of COVID, so please bear with us. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here, and I would like to especially thank my co-panelists. It's rare to bring together such a dream team of discussants on the topic of democratic resilience. So basically what we're going to do today is discuss a little bit about the concept of democratic resilience, especially focused on Central and Eastern Europe. And we have with us today a couple of very, very good experts on the subject, both academically and practitioners. The one conceptual characterization that I'd like to make in this intro is between the concept of attacks on democracy, so basically actions that are taken by authoritarian leaders to break the democratic equilibria of a society, and the capacity of that society to withstand these attacks and make sure that democracy endures. Basically, since the last wave of democratization that has been described in many ways, but I think the most poignant of all has been the end of history and the advent of liberalism, we've seen that what we have, in fact, is far from that. We have had quite a few examples of countries, especially in the CE region, that have broken the promise of liberal democracy and immediate catch-up to Western democratic order. But what we're discussing here today is how exactly these actions have been taken, especially how exactly the societies that these actions have been the purview of have resisted. So with us together, we have some very well prepared panelists, some of which are also participants in the Global Focus Center's project on democratic resilience, which I am coordinating together with Oana Popescu. It's a project that focuses especially on the CE region, but we will try to make the focus broader in the coming years. So I will be presenting the panelists, and just to kick things off and start a conversation, hopefully we'll be getting plenty of questions from the public, because this is an important topic that everybody's talking about. I'll also be asking questions. So one of our first panelists is Sorin Ioniță. He's a very, very well experienced practitioner in civil society and an expert in democratization for Romania and the CE region. He works for Expert Forum and has been a member of Romanian and Eastern European civil society for a very long time. Sorin, could you kick us off with some examples of attacks, the most blatant and perhaps the most successful attacks on democratic equilibria in the region in recent years?
I didn't expect you would start with me, and there are so many, I don't know where to begin. So we need to create a bit of order in these latest trends in the region. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So obviously we have influences coming from the east. Explicitly, that's one strand of undemocratic influence. And spectacular examples are when legislation similar to that in Kremlin against civil society, against opposition, against free media, or legislation regarding the freedom of speech, including online, is copied in some states, and then it's spread around through visible and invisible channels. For us in Romania, it was spectacular when we found a legal proposal in the parliament that was to in the Romanian language, it had very bizarre Russian-style phrases, translated into Romanian. And we wondered why. Why would be that? Because it turned out our legislators copied draft legislation from Chisinau, from the Republic of Moldova, and they were just trying to implement it, and they made some steps forward. And they in Moldova translated it from Russian, because we in Romania, we don't speak Russian, actually. So here you have a flow of legislation originating in Kremlin against civil society and free speech, with all these keywords, designating civil society organization as foreign agents and trying to restrict finance and, all how it is applied. And you can actually track how it came into a country like Romania, which is a member of the European Union. It happens that we share a language with the Republic of Moldova. It happens that they are practically bilingual in Chisinau, so it's easy for them to copy it. And when you have, because this is important, when you have retrograde governments, so governments who really mean evil, which is not the case now in Romania, but it was a case until 1 year ago, you can find this kind of influences. Another, of course, another spectacular network of influence were the consultants. The political consultants who were working in political campaigns, but not only, they were working for parties, for these illiberal parties in Eastern Europe, and they were sharing the same kind of consultants, and we could find a team of consultants who worked for Alexander Vucic in Serbia. They worked for the previous government in Romania. They were very successful in the last campaigns in the Republic of Georgia, actually. And rumors are that they also share with these consultants with Viktor Orban in Hungary, but that link is not so strong. They were active in Moldova and in Ukraine as well. And, it was copy-paste, the same kind of electoral campaign, the same kind of political message. And you can imagine what kind of message it was. So it was this latest strand of nativism, anti-liberalism, Trumpism, anti-migration in countries which do not have migration, which show you where the discourse, the narrative was borrowed for. In some countries, they were successful. I mentioned Georgia, Serbia, it's obvious. Not so successful in Romania, I have to say, although, in 2006, they contributed to that campaign. Last year, they were not so successful. So we can go on and on and on. We can try to detect influences of the narrative of Recep Tayyip Erdogan as well. Even personal connections. Personal connections are important in these regions, because not just us, not just the civil society communicates, across borders. It's not just us who organize conferences like this today. Also, the bad guys communicate to each other. They make friends to each other. They meet, although probably not so visibly, in private events, and they share experiences, and they share their successes, and they learn from each other. So if we speak of a network, that's not a conspiracy theory. Right. This is, you can put the finger on it sometimes. And, it comes from, it has, I have to mention this and I'll finish. It has a certain, prestigious, or rather an infamous history in our region, because look at the memes and cliches in the anti-Soros discourse, right, which is general in the region. It's not just in Budapest, it's general, right? Soros is a hate figure. The interwar cliches, the anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, anti-oligarchic cliches from the 30s are barely disguised. I mean, if you change, just the names in capital letters, you can transpose what was the name? Völkische Beobachter Zeitung from the Nazi journal from the 30s. And you can find bits of discourse copy-pasted into the political discourse today, just with Mr. Soros inserted there, or lately, and that's very bizarre, with Bill Gates instead of Soros.
So let me do a quick follow-up on that.
I have, commentators on Facebook who really believe that Bill Gates is also a Hungarian Jew.
Yes, that's
Through association, I mean,
Right.
Soros, Gates, they are all the same,
It goes to show that the practice of anti-democratic language doesn't necessarily change across time, but the way that we resist these anti-democratic attacks does change, and that's one of the things that's interesting, and exactly the examples that you gave, that you said similar attacks were tried in multiple places, but in some places they were more successful than in others. And I think that should be one of the things that we would want to talk about a bit later. So I'm going to follow up on that. But until then, I'd like to go further with our panelists and ask my colleague Veronica Angel. She's a colleague in our project on the measurement of democratic resilience, and she was a fellow at Stanford recently. She's a graduate of a doctoral program in Romania, and now she's currently a postdoc at the European University Institute, where I am also a researcher. Veronica, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Veronica, please tell us a few things, also from your experience working for the Economist Intelligence Unit on the region. Please tell us what you think is particular about the CEE, the Central and Eastern European region, and why exactly these attacks on democracy are different in this part of the region. Why are they more successful? Why are they less successful?
Simply put, when we associate the label of democratic backsliding with the expansion of the role of the executive and the liberal nationalism, this is a characteristic that was mainly associated with Poland under Law Justice and Hungary under Fidesz.
Veronica, could you speak up a little bit? We have trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me at all? Or
yes, we can hear you. This is much better. Much better.
Okay, then. Good morning again. So when, simply put, so for the last 10 years, we've associated the level of democratic backsliding with the expansion of the role of the executive and the liberal nationalism, right? So this was a characteristic of the trajectories of many Central European states. But primarily the main concern was coming from those who seem to have disappointed the most, which is Poland under Law and Justice and Hungary under Fidesz. They were the front runners of the transition, and so the betrayal seems much worse and the difference more stark than if, say, Romania and Bulgaria had shown similar trends. And the thing is that they do, but we really need to critically assess what this democratic backsliding is. Is it really a regional trend? And there are so many differences between these countries, and by focusing particularly at this linear sort of, by appropriating this linear view of what evolution can be, it's not enough, right? So when you ask what is the difference between these countries, first of all, there is a difference between these democracies and older democracies, right, Western European democracies, with whom there are more differences than similarities. But there are also differences between these countries in the region that we also need to critically look into and bring in much more context in our analysis. Because you mentioned the Economist Intelligence Unit Index, which is a very useful aggregate, right, of multi-dimensions. And it does show that there are problems in countries like these on different strands and different characteristics. But also, it's kept many of these countries, such as Romania and Bulgaria, on a very positive trend, because exactly it's a problem of weighing expectations. And it's not really always the case, right? So we have to do much more work to disentangle the differences between these countries. And I just want to make one point about what a major focus of our attention can be, and that is the fundamental role of illiberal socioeconomic structures, right? That is a major difference with the traditional democracies of the West. We need to zoom in our research and in our conversations about these trends on the role of oligarchical structures and corrupt networks. This is also part of my work, and I've spoken about it many times. In many situations, these render democratic state institutions ineffective, but we do not have enough enough data to analyze this. And secondly, another major difference between these countries is that we really have to separate between government efficiency and democratic stability and the quality of democracy. And this is when it gets really tricky, because that's also a big difference between these countries in Western Europe, but also in different degrees between the countries in the region.
Right. So you make a very interesting distinction between not just between Western democracies and CE democracies, but also among Eastern democracies. And you talk about government stability versus democratic stability. Could you give us some examples, perhaps, of which countries have one or the other in more of a finite kind of resource way?
Let's talk about Romania, right? Maybe that's what our audience is also more familiar with. If you think at Romanian stability or the quality of institutions, this would rank very low on many aspects, right? We have very short government duration, prime ministers change it almost every year, so the average duration of the cabinet is of about a year. Party volatility has been high, but then it's grown into more stability. But at the same time, you have grassroots mobilization increasingly in the last year, which is also a measure of quality of democracy. And this is what can also be a bulwark against and a measure for democratic resilience, right? So if you look at a country like this, you have both things that have progressed, but also things that have not progressed at the level of the expectations that we had or the population had in the 1990s. So you do have, on many dimensions, in even multi-party participation, coalition negotiation, it would seem on the surface that the country can be assessed as unstable, and also that it doesn't have efficient institutions. But at the same time, in other dimensions, quality of democracy can be quite good if you look at, for example, grassroots mobilization. And all these things work together. So that's why we build indexes, right? Because we have to aggregate, and it's a puzzle that we need to put together in order to understand much better the intricate nature of all these sort of systemic interdependent variables.
Right, thank you very much. This is a very interesting point that I'd like to go back to, this idea that the quality of one's democracy is not necessarily tied to the democratic resilience. So you can have countries that have a lower quality of democracy that are relatively resilient, not necessarily because of the government, but perhaps because of social mobilization, civil society, and other sorts of resources. And countries that have high governmental efficacy and stability and are also less resilient to democratic backsliding. And this is a very, very interesting point that we'd like to elaborate on. And speaking of which, we'll go to our next panelist. His name is Laurent Győri from Political Capital in Hungary, in Budapest. Hi, Laurent, can you hear us?
Yes. Hi.
Thank you very much for being here. Good morning. Laurent represents an institute that is one of the very few remaining institutes in Hungary that is still relatively vocal against the attacks on democracy that have been levied by the leader of the Fidesz party. And I think this offers us a good opportunity to ask a question that is perhaps on everybody's mind regarding the backsliding in the CEE region, which is this solely an issue of leadership? Would Hungary be in a better shape in terms of democratic resilience with a different leader from Viktor Orban?
Yes, this is a very good question. I think leadership does indeed matter. So Orbán Viktor had a deliberate plan to use his supermajority to transform the Hungarian institutional setting. So I think that's one aspect of the Hungarian democratic backsliding. But reflecting on Sorin and what Veronica said, I also agree that these hybrid regimes or autocratic tendencies tend to have an international pattern or even an international cooperation over time. This is what we can witness in Hungary with our Prime Minister, that he has been establishing relationships with President Putin, President Erdogan, and other populist or autocratic leaders in our region and outside of it. And also what Veronica said, that the illiberal social economic settings do matter. But I would like to talk about two main aspects of what we were witnessing in Hungary. One is, I think, typical for our region. It's a historical one. So dating back even as far as to the 19th century, I think Western institutional scientific examples, models of modernization have been adopted through a top-down process in our region, in each and every country. So in the 19th century, we are talking about kingdoms and pre-democratic state establishment. And following that, we had a string of autocratic system dictatorships. So I think there is merit to the famous and overused statement that our societies after the transition became democracies without democrats, meaning that the institutional setting was there, but the values, long-term value orientations, long-term attitudinal orientations needed in the society or in the population and in the political elite was still lacking. So I think this democratic backsliding has a historical aspect in Hungary as well. And when it comes to the actual Hungarian changes, I think we need to differentiate between the preconditions of the democratic backsliding and then the processes that were the drivers of the actual autocratic. And among the preconditions, we can identify one important external factor. That was the 2008 economic downturn. That was a huge deal, a huge blow to the middle class in our region and in Hungary. And also, I think it crushed people's dreams about, being able to reach the standard of living of Western societies. So I think that's an important external factor. But what was specific to Hungary was our electoral system. Because, this economic downturn happened in Romania, in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, other countries as well. But there you could witness only the change of government, not the change of the institutional setting. But what the second factor of the Hungarian democratic backsliding was about was the legal framework. So we had pretty unproportional electoral system, meaning that whoever won a slight majority of the votes or electorate, that could be transformed into a pretty stable majority within the parliament regarding the number of seats. This was an intentional design of the founders of the transition, because they thought they didn't want, a fractured political system. They didn't want a new weak democratic system. But then again, it was coupled with a supermajority that made possible the 2/3 of the votes to change the constitution. So we had the economic downturn, then Viktor Orbán got a supermajority, which provided him with the legal and legitimate ways of transforming the Hungarian constitution, and based on that, all the checks and balances. And I think what you mentioned in your question, the third aspect was the political intention of his political intention to never be pushed off the top of the Hungarian political top. Never. So eventually he decided during the 8 years of the opposition that this is his last and only chance to grab the power and become Hungarian prime minister once more. And when they won the supermajority, it was not a coincidence that our prime minister talked about the revolution of the voting booth. So he was like already, paving the way for his electorate or for the Hungarian population to reason why he almost immediately, because he's a really good and smart politician, immediately saw the legal ways how to cement his rule, how to transform into a one-man rule the whole Hungarian political system, which he has already done during the years of the opposition with his party. So he became the sole ruler, the sole decision maker when it comes to appointing MPs or deciding who is leading local branches of Fidesz in all over the country. So essentially, what it boiled down, there was there was an external factor, economic factor. There was a legal framework that was unfavorable in Hungary, and this kind of legal framework you could not witness in any other countries that transitioned from dictatorship into a democratic society. Not in Greece, not in Spain. So they were more cautious when it came to supermajorities changing making over the legal institutional framework. And thirdly, his intention to stay on top, whatever it takes.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting differentiation you make, and it's something that relates in a way to a question I had for our subsequent speaker. But before that, I'd like to thank everybody who's watching us for tuning in, and invite you to ask plenty of questions in the chat, and also people in the room, because we're going to be opening up to Q&A soon, and I'm really, really certain that you have plenty of questions that are going to be interesting here. Our last panelist, and the only other panelist in this room besides me, is my colleague and friend Costin Ciobanu, PhD at McGill University, a practitioner with lots of experience in political strategy and campaigning, and also a member of the team for the Democratic Resilience Index that we're building. Costin, my question relating to what Laurent just told us is, what do you think, especially for the CEE region, are the driving, the most important factors that lead to this type of one, democratic backsliding, and second, the manner that democratic resilience unfurls. And we have a couple of candidates. We have the leaders and their agencies. We have the institutional setting, the electoral law, such as Laurent was referring to. We have crises and triggers, such as the financial crisis and currently the COVID pandemic and crisis that is also very, very pressing. But we also have something that is a bit more intricate and something that we rarely talk about, which is perhaps an intention or a coagulated electoral belief and propensity towards more authoritarian leaders and less democratic equilibria in these countries.
Yeah, I don't think that I can give a straight answer to your question, but I think the first point to start is just to look at political leaders and political leadership, because at least in the way the democratic backsliding is defined, we start by looking at political actors. I know we define, at least based on the literature, backsliding as a certain kind of gradual, progressive attempt of political leaders to undermine the fundamental rules of the democratic game. So the onus is on what the political leaders are doing. And this is somehow consistent with what we know from the public opinion literature, because there's always this debate, who follows and who leads? Is it the public that drives basically the political answer, or is it just the leaders that are able to set up an agenda and basically, based on ideology or different kind of affiliations, the public comes to believe those kind of agendas? And this is particularly relevant in this time when we have a lot of personalization of politics. I know partisanship, at least in the voting behavior literature, is not as relevant as it was, but the leaders are very important. And not only that, we see an increasing role of the leaders, but we see a polarization in terms of leaders. So, and in the last 20 or 30 years, there is a certain kind of stability in terms of liking the political leaders, the one you vote for. But what happens is that you tend to dislike the other part. Right. So this somehow creates a structure of opportunity. So this is the starting point, but I think we need to look deeper when looking for an answer. And I think
Can I have a quick follow-up
here?
Because what you're saying is really interesting. So you believe that part of democratic backsliding is an intention of the authoritarian leader to increase polarization within the population?
It's an interesting dimension, because at least if you look at Central and Eastern Europe, you don't have the same kind of cleavage structures just to structure basically the votes. So you need something to anchor your political support. Because even if we have high volatility in Central and Eastern Europe, in the last 10 or 15 years, it has decreased. And I think one of the points that has directed this kind of process is just the attempts of the leaders, just to focus a lot on their personality, a lot on their agenda. And this can be seen a lot in the way in which the political campaigns are conducted in Central and Eastern Europe. And this attempt of polarization, you see, I think it's also this should be somehow related to what's happening with the democratic development, but also with the economic development. So you need to get the attention of the public. And the way you can do this is, polarization. It's something that can drive the attention. So I assume this is, not only a political agenda, in a way, it's also a performative act. Something just to put the attention of what's happening with politics. And it's political leaders are just very strategic actors. They just try to get the attention of the public. They just try to see what works and what doesn't. So I think this has been refined in a way, or just introduced by Orban in Hungary. But there for sure there has been a certain kind of diffusion process. But just moving a bit from political leaders, I think there are other aspects that have to be considered in this kind of relationship. There's an interplay of factors, and as you hinted, we need to just go beyond political leaders. And I think one point we're taking into account is just the motifs, and there's a certain kind of just quest for power, which is pretty clear in Romania and Hungary, but there's also a certain kind of ideology. There's a certain kind of ideological drive, behind these attempts. I think, Poland is the clear example of that. So we have different kind of, democratic backsliding attempts, but we have different kind of motivations. So I think it would be wrong to look at backsliding and just say, okay, this is just one way of just doing backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe. There are certain different kind of strands of backsliding. So you have these motifs, and then you have the opportunity structure, where I think the institutional factors play an important role. And as discussed before, the institutional setup, the constitutional rules, the 2/3 majority that you need to change the constitution. Okay, in the 90s, this was considered as enough just to prevent certain kind of backsliding, but it wasn't enough. And then you have basically the context. And yes, you
Can I ask a question that kind of ties things together with what Sorin started us off with his examples, and especially the examples of legislation that was copy-pasted from Russian legislation and then Chisinau legislation into Romania and other countries in the region. Do you think that there's the attacks on democracy that we're seeing in the CE region are exclusively or mainly factors that are encouraged by the Kremlin or by anti-democratic actors in the broader region? So we have Putin on the one hand, and Sorin also mentioned Erdogan in Turkey. These are actors that, because their grasp on power relies on a bit of authoritarianism, they're also encouraging other countries in the region to turn more authoritarian. Do you think that this is the main thrust of anti-democratic movements and attacks, or is there something different and more particular to countries?
So there are a lot of candidates, just to answer this question, and some would would look at political legacies in the regions, and there's a lot of literature showing how certain kind of authoritarian tendencies from the interwar period and consolidated during the communist rule have certain kind of impact on the quality of democracy in the region. There is also what I was mentioning here, the structure of opportunity and certain kind of opportunity presented to the leader that is taking into account. And there's a lot of political diffusion. And I think this process of just learning from what others are doing is not something that is related to conspiracy theory. It's just something present. You see what others leaders have been doing, and this is functioning not only, as Mr. Yunitsa was saying, this is functioning not only for the good guys, but also for the bad guys. But I don't really think that the main driver of this kind of process is just what Putin is doing, or just maybe Erdogan. I think this kind of these evolutions are consistent with the strategy and objectives of illiberal, non-democratic actors, and they're just trying to push these kind of agendas, and the way in which they can legitimate this kind of agendas is just by promoting certain kind of actors that are consistent, coherent with this kind of narrative. But just pushing narrative is not the same thing as creating the narratives. I think they are very good at it, just trying to create the structure for promoting this kind of stuff.
Right.
Because you need resources. I think you can tap into resources from domestic sources or from abroad. Right.
That's a very good point. So basically, we kind of agree that there's a coalition of the black backsliders, but their reasons aren't the reasons, and their strategies aren't necessarily unique. They're very, very country specific, or perhaps very leader specific. And that's also something that's interesting. Before any of my other questions, we already have some questions. I was expecting that actually, because it's a topic that riles a lot of people up. And the first question here is to Veronica and Costin, but everybody is invited to chip in. And the question is, increasingly there are voices that say people want democracy but also government delivery, and you can't have the former without the latter. So basically there's a connection between the quality of democracy and the quality of service provision, because people will lose faith in democracy. Do you think that connection between the quality of democracy and the existence of democracy and service delivery is true? Can you have good and stable service delivery without necessarily democratic institutions?
So I think what we have now is just a debate, about what democracy means, and we have just certain basically the war on liberal democracy. So this kind of liberal dimension is really contested, and one point of attack is exactly this, that this kind of liberal democracy does not deliver. So we are beyond just the 90s, where the idea was just the liberal democracy is the only game in town.
Right.
And what we see, not only from Russia, I'm not as concerned by what's Russia is pushing in the region, but what is coming from further east. The kind of alternative models where you can see prosperity, you can see a certain increase in standards of living, and at least in a certain narrative, this is connected with just lower emphasis on rule of law,
right,
on minority rights,
right,
on basically the liberal dimension of democracy.
So just to clarify, when you're saying further east, you mean China, right?
Yeah, China is one of the countries, and I'm more concerned about China than for Russia, because
right,
there you have a model that at least based on a certain propaganda works. So there is this, in the end, this is not about democracy or democratic backsliding. This is about the social contract.
right.
And just democracy is just, at least for Central and Eastern Europe, at this point, after transition and we know the whole process, democracy is part of that, and liberal democracy is part of that kind of social contract. And a contestation of the social contract just goes into making this kind of distinction, which, in my opinion, is not a good one.
Right. Let's go to Veronica. Veronica, if you want to answer this question, if you want to go further, I have a follow-up question on that. Why is this connection between service delivery and quality of democracy and democratic institutions in Eastern Europe so untenable? Why is it so easy for people to think the two are disconnected when in Western Europe and in more developed democracies, we've been, the population has been assailed, basically socialized into this belief that the two cannot go one without the other?
Well, the simple answer is we perceive them as, or people perceive them as disconnected because they are disconnected, right? So they don't.
Could you please?
I said that we perceive them as being disconnected because they are disconnected, right? They don't move in the same direction with the same speed. And Costin makes an excellent point about this, but I would still qualify that. It's not that liberal democracy is not delivering, but it is not delivering enough to meet the expectations and desires that were significantly overinflated in the 90s, right? And the electoral preferences and standards are always on the rise, while these institutions, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, they are not moving at the speed that it was expected in Eastern Europe. But we really need to put this into context. Despite all the challenges, European countries and democratic, in European countries, democratic institutions remain stable. Europe has still the highest average regional level of liberal democracy, according to most aggregate indexes. And this is very important for us to understand, because Europe is in a very good place economically. Any type of crisis seems like it's an existential crisis, like a crisis like you've never had before. But at the same time, these democratic institutions remain largely stable. And even now, right, let's take the example of the COVID-19 crisis. This did not have a visible impact on the state of most European democracies. It did amplify tendencies, but this also means that Eastern European elites maintained the same authoritarian directions that they were going in before the crisis. And even this significant exogenous shock has not generated a coherent populist response. With, we keep seeing polls that far-right populists are witnessing a drop in popularity. And it's a non-marginal potential for populist parties to be isolated on the fringes, right? So we should also take this into account. However, and this relates back to what Costin said, the conditions that produce the need for this surge of liberal nationalism have not disappeared just because we see a drop in preferences for populists and an increase in support for governments, because many of these governments, like in Germany, even in Hungary, they've delivered, right? They've risen to the challenge. And of course, this rally behind the flag effect had a very important effect on the population.
Okay.
But the economic recession and the unequal social effects that we will see will increase. And that is something that it mattered. This is where democracy resilience plays into the whole story.
That's a very good point. Thank you. And I'd like to take this opportunity to point out another of the differences between Eastern and Western Europe in terms of democratic backsliding and resilience, which is that in most Eastern European countries, the parties and the political movements that are responsible for the backsliding are not necessarily fringe parties. They're not far-right parties. They're mainstream parties that have in time moved more to one extreme or the other. And I'd like to take this opportunity to go to someone who's maybe a specialist in a country that is most afflicted by this issue. And Loran, please tell us, in a country that almost everybody agrees that has slid towards authoritarianism, does service delivery still function? And how does the population see this trade-off between, this potential trade-off between institutional independence, autonomy, and democratic equilibrium?
Yes. When it comes to the actual pandemic, I think what really works in favor of the Hungarian government is their projection of strength and stability. So they have taken good measures, very good measures based on science and based on facts to prevent the spread, or at least try to contain the spread of the coronavirus. So I think in this particular case, people are thinking that the trade-off is a good thing, that despite the Hungarian government being many times oppressive or very, very antagonistic to the opposition, to NGOs, now they sell the autocratic leadership as service delivery, as a measure of efficiency. But when we look at the longer trends, how this hybrid regime evolved over time in the last 10 years, we can see that Orbán and the regime itself had two main carrots or sticks that they employ. So first, they use the money transforms, mostly from the EU, but now from Eastern autocracies from Russia, to basically fund their political allies, a string of oligarchs. So basically have people of the elite, the middle class, interested in keeping them in power to a certain extent. And whoever they cannot finance directly, whoever they cannot really please because they don't have the resources or they just don't care, those are the poor or people living below the minimum wage. They created a new kind of feudalistic styled public works scheme, which takes care of them. So we have a saying here in Hungary that nobody's left at the roadside. So this is what they are doing. Nobody's left at the roadside, but some parts of the society, they are invested in Orban's power, because they are direct beneficiaries in terms of finances, businesses.
Sorry, Laurent. Let me push back on that a little bit, if you can answer quickly. If a big enough chunk of the population, a majority of the population, is so co-interested in Orban's success, wouldn't that be the explanation or epitome of democracy? Because you have a majority that's invested in your success, therefore you vote for that particular party because it benefits you. In what way is that something that we should be wary of? And if you could keep your intervention brief, because we still have plenty of questions.
Yeah, so there is a point about ideology, and the Hungarian regime is both relying on ideology, which is this rightist, far-right, Christian-based, sort of ideology. It is not really deeply rooted, but still the Fidesz electorate believes in it, and this is what Hungarian national identity is really built on currently in the political discourse. But there is this non-ideology approach that they try to establish pragmatic incentives that either motivate people for vote for the Fidesz, or motivate people to fear the ruling parties, so don't vote against Fidesz, or they are keeping track of them. So I think that would be the best answer.
Right. Thank you very much. And moving more closely to the idea of resilience and resistance to attacks on democracy, I'd like to go back to Sorin, and sorry for taking so long, because it's been a very, very intriguing conversation. And pulling things back together, you mentioned in the beginning, Sorin, that there were attempts that were relatively uniform, relatively coherent across multiple countries in the CE region to attack democratic balance and the democratic setting. And in some countries they worked, and in some other countries they didn't. And what's surprising, and we heard from the other speakers, is that in some of the countries where the quality of democracy was lower, they didn't work. And in countries where the quality of democracy was, or of the institutions was higher, such as Poland and Hungary, they did work. Is there something to that? And if you can tell us your opinions about why attacks on democracies worked in some places and didn't work in others.
Yes, I see.
Sorry, Sorin, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Say again. We can barely hear you, sorry.
I don't know what.
We have some technical problems. No, we can't. We can't hear you. Let's see if we can ask.
Can you hear me now?
Oh
Yes.
yeah, we can hear you now. Please.
Sorry, I had a speaker and an attached speaker on to hear you louder, and probably it cut my mic. Anyway, so I was saying that at some point we as scientists need to admit our limitations. This is a very intriguing question. Why do some leaders, illiberal leaders, succeed better than others, although all of them try to govern with the same agenda? Now, what I said before about, influence from Kremlin copying laws or using the same consultants, whether they are Israeli or Americans, and they are shared across the region. That's a more exotic part of the story. But of course, there are structural factors that can explain things. And of course, in our region, the crisis of the global economic crisis 8, 9, 10 played a role, of course, an oversized role, because it made the people, the societies more nervous, more polarized, and this was in tune with the West. And of course, leaders try to exploit this new reality. There's nothing, so special about it. But some were more talented than others, so we have to admit that. Some people, some nations like Romania were lucky to have very incompetent bad guys who screw up all their electoral campaigns, and they became hate figures. And they couldn't carry the electorate with them. They had the same agenda like Viktor Orban. They had the same consultants. It was a copy-paste, the same discourse. But Viktor Orban could carry the people with him. I mean, he got the votes, right? While our guys were voted out because they were hate figures for the majority of the population. We have to admit, politics is also art, not only science, after a certain point. And some people are more competent, more charismatic. Look at Orban, look at Vucic, maybe even the guys in Poland. I mean, I know they have a bad press, but there is something about them, But there's something more here in the game. So the same bunch of leaders, they try to exploit this new environment, this new reality, more nervous, more risk-averse populations after the global economic crisis. They imported narratives like this crazy one with the anti-immigrants, and it played a role in Hungary, it played a role in Serbia. They tried to play it up in Romania, it didn't work. It's crazy all over the region because there are no immigrants as well. So it's a typical example of imported narrative from the West, like they were trying to import now in Romania the pro-gun narrative, which is even crazier. It's the issue does not exist. But some influencers trying to import it. Why? Because it's very popular in America and they read on those blogs all the time and they are neocons. There's one more factor. It's rule of law and anti-corruption. It played a very big role in many countries in the region. Look at Romania, look at Bulgaria, who is supporting the rule of law agenda, who is beating, the ruling parties and the governments about the head with the MCV mechanism, with monitorization. It's the European Union, of course, right?
Right.
So if you are a leader in Romania, if you lead the government, what are you going to do when the prosecutors come after you? Just sit there and hire the best lawyers? No. You try to undermine the moral ground of the very institution that brought this agenda into Romania, and that's the European Union. And this is why they become anti-European. This is why they borrow bits of discourse from Vladimir Putin without mentioning it, because Romania, like Poland, is a very Russophobic country, so you cannot be associated with Kremlin, with Moscow at all. It's poison. But like in Poland, you can copy Putin's agenda, just don't mention it, make it national, put it in national dress, and then it works. And you become anti-European, you blame everything on Brussels, and you come up with these topics, memes, from the tiers-mondiste discourse, we have always been exploited by the West, they try to acquire our markets, It's a long story. I mean, the menu is huge, so you can exploit everything, and this is what they did. But at the end of the day, some were more talented than others. Unfortunately for Hungary, Viktor Orban seems to be very competent at this game. While Mr. Dragnea in Romania ended up in jail because he couldn't carry the people with him on this agenda. Are we immune as Romanians to that? Of course not. One day, a talented leader can appear and exploit this agenda. But otherwise, we have to admit, in this last decade, we have a problem with the narrative and political discourse, because Laurent was mentioning before Hungary and stagnation. Well, that's not really true. Even after the global economic crisis, even Hungary is converging with the West. We are all converging with the Western Europe. We are catching up even after the crisis, and that's the reality. But the problem is people, ordinary voters in Eastern Europe, they don't judge by this reality because life is short. They don't compare themselves where they started in 1990. They don't compare themselves with Zimbabwe. They don't compare themselves even with Argentina, which has been backsliding for 100 years, economically, I mean. They want Denmark here tomorrow, in Bucharest, in Budapest, because we travel. We travel in Europe. Every blue collar in Romania can travel freely. They go and come back. They go to Italy, they go to Spain, they go to Germany. They experience good local governments. They experience good services. I mean, top of the top services in terms of global ranking. And they want it tomorrow here in the outskirts of Bucharest.
Thank you, Sorin.
So they are somehow blind to this convergence. And you can never run a political campaign persuading people that they are doing better than they were faring 20 years ago. I mean, who remembers that in 1990, Romania was below Moldova and Ukraine in terms of GDP, and now we are 5-6 times higher than that.
Thank you, and that's a very interesting point, and it goes back to some of the more structural issues that we were talking about with Costin earlier. So, Costin, if you have anything to add to this question, I'd be very much interested to hear it. But I'd also like to add a more, let's say, philosophical question. Why is it that in most places, at least in Eastern Europe, do anti-democratic or backsliding attacks on societies and institutions have an ideological tinge that is generally nationalist, traditionalist? I'd like to call it, I don't necessarily want to call it right-wing, but I think that it ties in better with the idea of conservative traditionalists. Is this a temporal kind of, a contextual kind of particularity for anti-democratic movements, or is it something that's a bit more programmatic? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I would start by looking at the populist movements in Western Europe, and when you just look at their initial agenda was very neoliberal. So I would connect this somehow with a reaction to globalization. We see certain kind of trends against deglobalization and a certain kind of resurgence of nationalism. Because we know very well, globalization, overall worked very well, but there are still some, winners and losers. And what's particular to Central and Eastern Europe, I would add, is what happened in the 90s and 2000s. So this whole process of economic integration and European integration has been associated with an internalization, with Europeanization. So we have gone a lot on that kind of direction, and I think we're just somehow just moving back. There is a natural tendency of things just to balance. So there is a certain kind of international dimension, which is, global rise of nationalism, connected mainly with globalization aspects, but there is also a certain kind of rediscovery of regional roots. And you see this is not politics. This just works in arts, in literature. So you have this idea of just exploring more the local identity. And I would just make this distinction between the economic factors and the cultural factors. So my own research looks at the impact of economic shocks in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's somehow surprising that, even with the economic crisis that took place in 2008, 2010, these kind of shocks, labor market shocks, are not really influential in terms of just voting behavior. And there's this growing agenda on identity, cultural aspects. And yeah, we don't have migrants in Central and Eastern Europe, but the labor force transformation is a reality. So this idea of just, we'll have in the next 10, 20 years a debate about just, unless automation prevails. But we'll have a debate about who will work in this kind of country. Are we bringing people from East Asia, Southeast Asia, or from Middle East? So these people are just trying to, these politicians are trying to take advantage of this kind of agenda. Obviously, this is not really rooted in local reality at this point. But I would like to highlight this idea of just growing importance of identity and cultural factors. And we can call some nationalist patriotism or something like that, but this is growing, and this is one of the factors to look. Even if it's not directly related to democracy, I would still pay attention to it.
Right. Thank you very much, Costin. And unfortunately, Costin will have to leave us right now. He has a pre-existing appointment. But I'd like to extend my thanks for his presence and participation here today. We'll continue the conversation with our online panelists. And again, to our followers and the people in the room, please add more questions for our panelists. And I will try to integrate them as well as possible in the conversation. So right now, I'd like to go back to Veronica and ask a question that is perhaps important more from a conceptual point of view. And that question relates to the reason for the attacks and the attempts to reduce the equilibria of
Danny, I can't hear you. I lost you.
Can you hear me now? I'm not.
I can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, we all lost him.
Well, probably lost the connection with them.
I think that. Can you hear me now? There might be a problem.
On Facebook anyway, and we have like 8 viewers, so we're speaking among ourselves.
We're speaking.
That's great.
Yeah, 8 viewers.
Mai vorbesc eu?
I think they're from Global Focus.
Asta să vorbească ei. Right, so what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be remedying some technical difficulties, but we still have another good 20-30 minutes of conversation here. I'd like to use this opportunity to introduce this question regarding the reason for the backsliding actions and how they are. What is their ultimate purpose? And my question to my co-panelists and the people in the room and in the audience is: if we believe that these intentions, these attacks, are they connected to a divide and conquer kind of ideology, an intention to preserve power, and therefore in their drive to preserve power, they're dismantling democratic equilibria, or is it more of an intention, a very personalized kind of intention to dismantle democracy just for the sake of dismantling democracy? Do we have any thoughts on that? Panelists, can you hear me now? Not yet. Right. So let's take the opportunity to go through some of the ideas that we visited in this conversation. So we talked about why the CEE region is unique. Costin referred us, and multiple of the panelists actually referred us to the legacies and the fact that most of these Eastern European countries have gone through a long spell of authoritarian communism, that came not only with authoritarianism, but also a very deep ideological charge. So we have a level playing field between Eastern European countries that have gone through communism, but we also have differences between these countries. And these differences are related to the economic conditions, the quality of service delivery in these countries. Some countries are richer and some countries are less rich. And we also have a major and important difference in terms of the personalities of the leaders. So who is it exactly in this country, in these countries, that gets a grip of power, and how they use that power in order to personalize their standing. Panelists, can you hear us now? Are the technical difficulties remedied? Panelists?
Yeah, we're back.
Welcome back.
We were disconnected, but now we're back.
I hope that you at least had a good conversation among yourselves, and maybe you want to share something with us right now.
You can be sure of that. You can be sure of that.
That's very good.
What was your question, Danny? Was it about cultural aspects? That's where we were cut off.
Yeah.
Costin made some points.
My question was if this drive to attack democracy by these leaders in CE countries, is it purely instrumental towards their preservation of power? Are they only doing it because they want to stay in power and are willing to sacrifice anything for that, or are there other reasons for that?
If I can move in first, because I was writing immediately after Costin, but probably the comment was lost in this connection. There's a mixture. Of course, if you are a pragmatic political leader and you want to be in office, you need to exploit all the circumstances, and this is a very good one. And to what Costin was saying, that yes, in the West, this new wave of conservative politics had to do something with migration, while we in the East, we don't have migration. But I would attribute this new strand of politics to the unfinished national projects of the 19th century. We are young nations, at least Romania, Bulgaria, and we have an unconsummated relationship with modernity. So people underestimate. When communism fell in the late 80s, we thought that we would go to open society, to Sorosist open society, and people will become global citizens, and we will have full democracy. Well, we discovered, at least in some countries of Eastern Europe, that people went back to the romantic nationalism of the 19th century, which was never fully consumed because of history, because, all those revolutions and then the freezing period of communism. And it was so natural and so tragic in Yugoslavia, for example. So it was a continuation, if you want, of something which was left unfinished. Okay. This is a very powerful force, and it was underestimated, and it has nothing to do with the threat of migration or the labor market.
That's a very good point.
Because, the labor, the transition, the modification, the challenges on the labor market is something that we discussed, Danny, and some demographers. Right. It's not part of the public discussion very much in the region.
But people might feel them, although they don't necessarily conceptualize them. I fully understand your point, and I think that it goes back towards the legacies argument that we were discussing earlier. Veronica, Laurent, do you have any thoughts on this?
If I may jump in on the aspect Sorin mentioned about modernization. So it has this historical aspect with which I fully agree. But we also need to remember that when our transition happened, we were already in the late stages of the global capitalist system, which means that that kind of modernization already presented some sort of failures of the welfare states, or the diminishing of welfare states that were established after World War II in the West. So I think what our populists see as a new cleavage to take advantage of is this postmodern process of globalization or modernization that casts some countries, some regions as winners, who are able to import the global capital, who are able to adapt to the new technologies, and others are cast as losers or just regions and countries who miss this whole process.
And do you believe there's more of those people in these countries that we're talking about?
I think yes. I mean, it depends. Obviously, with the internet and with the new media, media literacy became a central aspect of your capability to join and be productive on the market. So even though literacy is very high in Hungary, but let's say 2 or 3 million people, and you can witness this in the United States as well, they are just not really able to use the new technologies. They are not able to connect to this new modernization process, which renders them, somewhat incapable of achieving success. And I think this is where local identities, nationalism, the strength of religion or churches come into play, because what populists can claim, both for defending their autocratic style of governance, and both to say to their electorate that, look, we are looking after you, we are defending you against this evil globalist George Soros or Bill Gates, whoever they might be. But this is really reflecting on this huge and new cleavage between the local and the global, between global.
Thank you, Laurent. That's a very good point, and I'd like to use that to piggyback on for a question for Veronica, because she was talking about grassroots mobilization earlier. Actually, we were all talking about grassroots mobilization and how this grassroots mobilization of civil society has been one of the main pillars of resilience. How do these two ideas square? Because we have the people that are disenfranchised, the people that Laurent was talking about, the people that are left behind, and we also have the people that are fighting against authoritarianism. Are they the same people? Are they different people? Who do we expect has the better chance to win? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think this is an amazingly important conversation, and it's so many views, but in most of our studies, we really do not find evidence that backsliding or nationalism is connected to this category of people who are left behind. There is a genius category that pushes things forward in the direction of nationalism. And my point is that, I mean, of course, these two things work together at the same time, and it's quite logical. There is nothing new about conservatism in Eastern Europe. There is no comeback to conservative values. These have always been there. In fact, polls actually show that there's a significant convergence of values between East and West after the integration of these countries in the European Union. Well, that said, the differences are still high, right? There's a lower acceptance of minorities. There's a high tolerance in the East towards Muslim, Jews, sexual minority, legal abortion. People identify more with Christian religion. There's a higher percentage of nativism, right? So this all plays out, and it circles back to your question about the role of leaders. This is the difference between supply and demand. There is a demand for people, for leaders who meet these kind of expectations that are different to a certain degree in Eastern Europe compared to the West. And at no point, even if we consider Viktor Orban or Kaczynski or PSD, NLA, even the Romanian president Klaus Iohannis as being these kind of charismatic in any way leaders, it doesn't, and thwarting institutions and increasing executive power, they do have this strand of conservatism in them as well. Maybe Lauren can tell us more. But in no conversation I've ever had with Fidesz members or leaders did I have the feeling that they don't believe in these kind of attitudes themselves, and that they are not also a reflection in addition to their pragmatism. And this is very important, right? So they are really not just man-made, artificial. And the other point I was trying to say is about the idea of Eastern European countries being young nations, and that is important to preserve or to consume the idea of this nation without getting too philosophical. The fact that we are a young nation is what could potentially save us. The fact that people leave the East to integrate in the West increases the quality of the citizens. And in the end, what is your state without getting too abstract, right? Any citizens have a better life. Problem is that what they leave behind is a weakened state. But in the end, is that something that is very important, or how do we deal with that? So I think that these ideas that we talk about are really rational, and they can be codified in a way that will make us more aware of the complexities of the situation without blaming everything on the leaders.
And on that thought, thank you very much for all of the panelists. That's a very, very good thought to end on, this idea that there is something that we can do to supply more quality to the leadership and to political entrepreneurship in the close future, either through direct political actions and political parties, or through a better organized and more vibrant civil society that will be capable to withstand attacks on democracy and create that type of democratic resilience that we're so interested in, to support these ideas that we're fighting for. Thank you very much to my co-panelists. Thank you very much to Costin, and we wish him very good luck in his previous appointment. And thank you very much for the people who have followed us either through social media or here in the room. Unfortunately, this is the type of panel that we can offer during the age of COVID, and I am sure that there would have been many more questions to ask and answer. But I have a feeling that we will be talking about democratic resilience for a long time. So perhaps, fortunately or unfortunately, we will have the chance to discuss more questions in the future. Thank you very much. Have an excellent day. Thank you very much to the Râșnov Historical Film Festival, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you. Bye.